Be my black t-shirt. Hey everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We're talking about millennials and EQ. My friend here, Jim Hogan, is on with me, and right before we were getting on, we were teasing each other. Jim's looking very sharp with his vest, and I'm doing the millennial thing in a black t-shirt, which is pretty much my uniform around here. We are very excited to be jumping into a topic that, frankly, I've been really fascinated with for a long time. I've had a lot of people ask me about EQ, emotional intelligence, whether or not there's a difference between the millennial EQ versus the EQ of maybe Xers or baby boomers. Does it change with age? I have a lot of leaders that we get to work with on a daily basis, asking questions around, what kind of leadership principles do I need to have to better engage the next generation? So rather than me answering, I decided to bring on an expert, and that is Jim. Jim is one of our newest trainers who joined the Millennial Solutions Certified Training Team. We're very excited to be partnering with him in doing live training. He is an executive coach. He has years of experience working with executive leaders and sales teams, helping them understand how to work better together, the dynamics of one-on-one relationships, and how you can actually use those relationships to be more productive, more fulfilled, just overall have a better life experience. So Jim, thanks for joining us.
I'm just happy to be here. I'm glad we got the chance to join everyone here who made it online. And I'll tell you, it is, if you can tell, I'm not a millennial. I'm at the tail end boomers, and I'm proud of it. However, I will tell anybody that's listening that I was probably born in the wrong generation, because I have, of all the millennial myths, I got almost all of them. So I'm having so much fun in this workplace and work environment, and taking my history and just diving deep into helping people do better and prosper.
That's right, and that's why we do what we do. I'm excited to talk about EQ because it's one of those things. I think it's one of the hot button terms, like change management or executive coaching, that people talk about, but they don't necessarily get into what it actually is. So what's an actual definition? How do you explain to people what EQ is in a way that doesn't sound like you just read it from a textbook?
Well, it's probably going to sound like I'm reading from a textbook. However, emotional intelligence came out in the 80s, really found its way in the 90s through psychological research. And they developed the EQ test, which is as opposed to an IQ test. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about the difference between EQ and IQ. Emotional intelligence, it developed into a scientifically measured and validated studies that let people go, do I have high, do I have low? If you remember from school, the bell-shaped curve, they fit right in there with, what's the middle, what's the first segmentation, and the next ones and the next ones. And in the assessments that I've done, I've seen a full range. Some people are aware of it, some people are not. Not all EQ tests are validated. And I work with the EQI 2.0, EQI 60, which is a 360 assessment using leadership EQI. And that's developed through and managed by Multi Health Systems, which is a Canadian company, and their leader who defined. So that being said, EQI, as defined by MHS and Dr. Stein, it's a set of emotional and social skills that influence the way we perceive, that's me, express ourselves, that's you, and how I outwardly, how we develop and maintain social relationships, cope with challenges, and use emotional information in effective and meaningful ways. So that's the words. Now, what does that mean? That means we have self-expression, we have self-perception, interpersonal skills, decision-making, and stress management. Those 5 pieces are the main parts of the model that I use to measure and coach and train inside of emotional intelligence.
So we talked before about what kind of out of those five, what affects the workplace the most when it comes to generations? And I have my opinion about it, and we'll talk more about it. But what do you think out of those five is the most either frustrating or the one that you can kind of pinpoint the most and say there's clearly a difference in generations when it comes to this part of EQ?
EQ can be developed, and from a generational standpoint, it peaks somewhere in the 60s. So that's a lot of history, a lot of.
Did you say in someone's 60s or their 50s?
At 50s and 60s is where it's going to peak. But that doesn't mean we don't have extremely high emotional intelligence in people. And the way I look at it is, if you're a millennial and you can identify where your strength is, how can you get beyond that? And how can you grow your emotional intelligence to peak it earlier and use what you've got?
So someone peaks in their 50s or 60s, but I think you started to touch on something that I find really fascinating. So your EQ can change. So have you seen because you're doing these assessments for companies, for really large groups, and you actually break down people's EQs with them, which I think is craziness. But have you seen people, as you've worked with them, grow in their EQ or decrease in their EQ?
When people do the assessments, they almost get a little confused. If they have a lot of self-awareness, they're going, I understand. I can see it. That's actually how I interact with the world. And that's it's how we interface with people, with situations, and how we move through life. So it's how it shows up both publicly and privately. And I'm aware of where I'm strong and where I'm weak. Watching other people you look at a piece of paper, it's usually like an 18-page report. So it's pretty thorough. It has numbers, it has colors. So yeah, it's good. It's actually easy to read. And they give you some tips and tricks going, this is where it is. This is how it shows up in the workplace, and here's some tips and tricks. Now that's the report. The debrief that I get to do talks around and about those, how they answered questions. Were they trying to game the system? Do they want to appear smarter or more emotionally intelligent than they are? And those are exposed through a validated test that's easier to see that. Do they always answer high, like always, or never? That's a pretty difficult thing to answer, always quote answer. And once they're aware, we talk about how to identify when you're high and low. And the first step I usually tell people to do is, when you're interacting with them, start watching them. And if you can see how they are interacting with people, and in a meeting, on a conference call like this, you'll see emotions come out. You'll see when stress hits and how they interact. The smart people are cooler, calmer, they listen more, and it's pretty clean to be able to see that. So the awareness and looking outward, and then measuring yourself.
Because we always like to focus on the millennial side of things, I know that you've been able to pull some of the research when it comes to really that strata of information about EQ across the generations. Have you found anything to be particularly unique about the millennial orientation to EQ versus, say, Xers or baby boomers?
It's kind of interesting, and going through your book, the 5 millennial myths, when you look at the one that you always say is a possibility, and it's being addicted to your stuff, your electronic, all those pieces, right? They're very unaware of how that affects people around them. It's because we talk about that when I do group individually. Why can't I talk to somebody? How come I can't get a phone number? I mean, for me, my first line of defense is, I'll email, I'll text, and if I can't find it, I've got to call somebody because we've got deadlines and things. Um, I have heard more than once, well, you got my text, didn't you? From a millennial. I'm going, well, maybe, but what's my preferred method? So it's not always, it's learning to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes and say, how do I get the most out of Jim? Maybe I need to adjust slightly. That's the awareness is, it's all about
awareness. That's interesting. So do you think because of the millennial use of technology and because we always have our phones within reach of us constantly, that's made us less likely to interact, to have high emotional intelligence because we're so used to using technology to kind of mitigate a lot of our relationships?
I think the biggest gap right now in communication is verbal communication, and some of that goes written, where we assume there's, I don't know how many parts of communication. You send a message, somebody has to receive it, not only receive it, but understand it. So just because you send a message doesn't mean I understand it. And you have to be aware of the wording, of all the other implications. And it's not just, words mean a lot. And I've lived a different life than you, and if you use the same words that I might perceive it differently. So from a perception standpoint, how did I receive it? That's what the message is. Was it harsh? Was it short? I didn't know that you didn't have 3 minutes to write a clear message, edit it, make sure that it said what you wanted to say. You were just blasting it off because you have 3 other people to talk to.
Quick question here, Tim.
But that's and there's
talking about the echo. Do you happen to have an earbud, like a
I'm going to do that real quick.
Jump into.
I'm going to put me on mute, and you talk for a second. I'll be right with you.
Don't you worry. Thanks everybody for letting us know about the echo, because one of those things we don't know until we talk to you guys. But why I'm particularly really excited about continuing this conversation with Jim is because we hear complaints, frustrations, whether they're valid or overblown, about how millennials have been raised, particularly with technology and how that's changed how we interact. Now, if you've seen any of our presentations that we do for any of our corporate clients, we talk a lot about how technology is a tool. It's a tool that can be used to help connect us, but it also, unfortunately, has been something that my generation has used as a shield away from many of the really important interactions that they're having with one another. One of the biggest mistakes each of us make, whether we're 22 or 62, is that we project our own experiences, our own expectations, our own preferences on the other person. And what Jim was saying was, when a millennial is, say, texting someone else, assuming that, of course, the other person wants to text, you're ultimately making not only an assumption, but you're really putting your own values and your own preferences on the other person. So whenever we teach millennials, we do a lot of training and onboarding programs for companies. We do a lot with students. And I always tell them, whenever I'm doing coaching, the first thing you should do when you get into a new job is to ask your supervisor how they best communicate. And that not only shows that you respect their time, but it says, hey, I have emotional intelligence high enough to understand that just because I prefer texting, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And that's going to really help save you a ton of time. So examples like, hey, is it okay if I call you after work on your cell if something happens? Do you prefer email? Do you like face-to-face communications, or, is a digital meeting suffice it, or, something that I would prefer? So keep in mind having the open communications on the front end. I think it's a valid concern. And the next question I've been getting asked, I just got back from Hawaii doing that. I know, feel bad for me, but I was working out there. And one of the big questions I got when I was out there was, what about Gen Z? And it's true. if you think millennials are bad when it comes to technology, I think millennials are really the appetizer in comparison to what we're going to start to see with Generation Z, which is a newer generation, a younger generation that was really born with tech in their hands. And scientists are actually starting to see that their brains are forming in a different way. And I think this conversation about EQ is going to be even more important in the next 10 to 15 years as a younger generation who can't remember what it was like to have dial-up, let alone, not having Wi-Fi. And technology is one of those things that connects us. I mean, this is crazy that we can, I know we've got people from all over the world on here today, and it connects us, but it can also make digital communications seem like the only thing that's important. So, Jim, are you back? Jim says, sorry about that. Let me know if this is better. If you talk, I can absolutely let you know that it's better. I think you're still on mute though, my friend. Go ahead and talk and see if that's okay. See, you guys just get to be here with us in the midst of it, in the noise, in the mess. And I want to get back to some of your questions too. I know Kitty was asking about, why do you say it peaks in your 50s? And I would love to hear why Jim said. I think kind of anecdotally, I would assume that it's just people tend to become more self-aware as they get older. But as we all know, not everyone is very self-aware. Some people become less self-aware. Still can't hear you. Still cannot. We'll get him back on. I'm not really that worried about it. But one of the other things too that I was excited about bringing Jim on to talk about is because he actually provides training. He's been in the middle of it, working with top companies to help them understand EQ from a one-on-one basis. So many of us think about EQ as a relationship with our kids. So, being able to kind of read through the fray, understanding kind of the nuances of relationships. Some of us know EQ from a management leadership perspective, knowing the EQ of your team. Some of us know EQs from more of a relationship, either friendship or romantic. And EQ really cuts across the board. And growing your skills in one area absolutely helps you with the other. But I keep coming back to this technology piece of being able to actually read people because and I've been involved in different VR projects in the past. And so because of that, we have kind of necessarily come to a conversation about what role does technology play? And will virtual reality or augmented reality completely replace one-on-one conversations? And the purist in me, the communicator in me wants to say absolutely not. But we don't know what the future is going to look like. We don't know what kind of the interactions are going to look like, and if convenience and speed is going to trump effectiveness. But there really is nothing that can replace one-on-one conversations, because although we can broadcast this around the world, it would be completely unique for me to sit down with each of you in a small room and actually have this conversation versus having it on a technological platform. So are you good, Jim?
Let's see.
Yes, we're back. We're back. Thank you for doing that. So can you, before you jump too much further, I do want to get to Anne's questions, specifically about why in your 50s and 60s, your EQ tends to get stronger. Why is that?
I think you alluded to it. People, is this echoing still?
I mean, I can't hear an echo, but
okay.
If y'all can.
History and learn as you learn, you have a lot more experience, and that would be through interpersonal communication, handling stress. You develop yourself in many different ways, and that's just a natural progression, whether you're naturally good at it or you're trained yourself. So it does taper off after the 60s, and that's probably because the cynical part comes back and says, who cares what anybody else thinks? But that's just me. That's not scientific.
I know a couple people like that in every generation. How's that? How is that? So I wanted to get back to my original question. Is there a difference in EQ in each of the generations? Does the data show anything that helps us understand maybe an EQ type, if millennials tend to be less or tend to be more?
I think it goes to interpersonal skills. Because of electronics, you've removed yourself from what you believe to be interpersonal skills. You think a like is interpersonal. It's not.
He's just dashing hopes
from my standpoint. Anyway.
Around the world right now.
However, you have a better reach, and I do too, because I'm on social media. We have a better reach to be able to engage more people, but we fall short in true relationship and engagement.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge amount of sense. And I think it's in Leaders Eat Last, but Simon Sinek talks about how there's actually a chemical reaction that happens in our head when we get a like or a share, and it's addictive in nature because we're so drawn towards kind of outward acknowledgement of who we are. It's kind of those digital attaboys that, you know, we rush to our devices to see, oh, how many shares did I get or how many likes did I get? And I can only imagine what that's going to look like with millennials in the long term. I think we're starting to see in the short term in relationships, romantic relationships in particular, where it's becoming much more measured based off of your interactions, like almost like an Uber type relationship where you instantly can like rate each other and move on with your day, because we're becoming so data driven, I think, as a society, that millennials are now so used to measuring interactions rather than reading interactions.
I'm with you 100% on that. And dating would scare me if I had to go dating right now. I don't want to be judged that much, I can tell you.
It's a new world out there, Jim. It's a new world. I met my husband on Facebook, so I can't really say too much about it. But okay, so I want to now get into the really practical side of things. I know we've got parents on, we've got some millennials on. We actually have a really good mix of millennials, experts, and boomers on, which is awesome. But what are some tips and specific strategies that you would give to a millennial? So a millennial who's on with us, to how do you grow your emotional intelligence?
I always lean towards the leadership side. You need followers. That means communication skills. Being an executive coach lets me talk with people about how to create better relationships, how to inspire people. And you can't manage the way you used to, which is, and I kind of call it it's kind of like find it and fix it. That's the old way. Okay, where's the problem? Let's fix it. Do this, do this, do this. Directing management versus being curious, inspire, and help people figure it out. So the FIO, go ahead and figure it out. Tell me what you got. What kind of coaching culture can you build inside of a company to get people to communicate better versus just waiting for that next direction and waiting for someone to do it? You can't learn to make decisions if you can't make a decision.
That is very profound.
Right?
I'm going to make that a bumper sticker.
Yeah, if you're not given the opportunity to make a mistake, what's one of the terms now? Fail fast. Maybe small fails. That's what a manager can do. That's what a leader can do to help people build their decision-making muscle, learn to handle pressure, and those are emotional intelligence skills.
Yeah, emotional intelligence, you can tell me you're the expert, but it really is something that you grow over time. And I can even say, as a millennial, seeing how putting myself in different situations has really grown particular parts of my ability to work with other people that are different or unique than you. And I think one of the really strong attributes of the millennial generation is that we love diversity. We love learning from other individuals. We love surrounding ourselves with people with diverse backgrounds and diverse points of view. We don't necessarily always see that kind of curiosity when it comes to the generational aspect. We see millennials more interested in kind of cultural diversity than they do generational diversity. And I think raising an awareness towards my generation to help them understand diversity of thought and experience really stems from diversity of age as well. What would you say for a millennial kind of in that phase of their life where maybe they're realizing, wow, I don't necessarily have the emotional intelligence that I should. Maybe I'm reading into situations incorrectly, or I'm not reading situations at all. What are some really quick ways that they can start to question? Of course, you have an actual assessment for people to take, but in lieu of an assessment, right, or I guess even before an assessment, what are some questions they should start to ask themselves to determine their own emotional intelligence?
Well, reading always helps. You can find anything out there to just get a basis of the model and whatever model you look at. But you've got how I present myself, how people perceive yourself. Those two alone, and how you interact with people. You need almost an accountability partner, somebody who you know and trust, who can watch you. So if you're in a meeting and you ask somebody to see how is your message received the way you think it should be? Is it presented? Is it received? Do people take action? You might think you're being very calm and cool, but your face is not saying that. Somebody else has to help you when you get really stressed.
We have definitely all been in situations where either we needed someone to give us the outside perspective, or we wanted someone and maybe they weren't there. So that's a great point. When we teach networking skills for millennials, we talk a lot about bringing a buddy with you. So someone who can help introduce you. That's a really great way to cut through that awkward barrier. It's always easier to have someone else brag about you, but that's a really great point. Why not bring someone with you and give you feedback and analyze, hey, how did I interact with that person? How was I presenting myself? Did I come across in the way that I want to come across? Because all of us are kind of shielded from the truth of who we are because of the perspective that we have. And so getting someone who's honest, right? You don't want a yes man or your mom coming with you, right? Depends on who your mom is. I don't know. I know some New York moms who will tell you exactly how you should change. So make sure you get someone who's going to be honest with you. Let's talk about the leadership and management side of things. One of the biggest challenges I think leaders of all ages have is, how do you interact with those that you lead in a way that's authentic, but also too doesn't question your authority. And I think that that's a unique challenge that many baby boomers have, is that asking for help or saying you don't know the answer is seen as a weakness. Whereas for my generation, that's seen as a strength. So how would you help baby boomers increase their emotional intelligence in a way that seems and is authentic to my generation?
I think authenticity is built from integrity, and that's a two-way street. And I think we have to make sure that just because I have a leadership role doesn't mean that I am leading. You need a follower. You have to earn the right, instead of the military side of things would say, I've got the bars, you do what I say. That's not how you're going to motivate and inspire a millennial. And if the current leaders don't see that, then that's going to be a huge problem. The other side of that is the pressure coming down from the top to some of the current leaders, and the skills that they're developing, they may not have those skills, and they don't know how to do it different, and they can't slow down enough to create that nurturing culture that is going to be the future for the workforce.
So I know that you're a baby boomer, but you're not. You even admitted it, that you're much more millennial, I think, than you are a baby boomer. But I meet a lot of people who are kind of misplaced generationally. It's a mindset, right? It's a mindset. But what do you say to some of your peers having conversations about EQ? Don't they just think that it's kind of emotional mumbo jumbo? And, do you have, because I know you've done work with military, like we do a lot of work with the military. Have you had people even question the merit of being able to talk about EQ as an actual science?
the smart leaders right now are talking about it. Those people that are resistant and ready to walk out the door, they're having all kinds of trouble with this. Yes, mumbo jumbo. They don't know what to do. They can't change. They resist change. And with the accelerated change going on in the world, in business, in personal communication, if you're not keeping up, you're getting farther behind every, few days, it seems like. I think the smart people know. They're just looking for a way to embrace it and put it into the model that they have, or they're going to be, shipped out the door. I look up to the traditionalists, and I've been mentored by some pretty smart guys, and they know that EQ is what got them. It wasn't called EQ back then, but they know that's what got them where they are.
Yeah, those classic leadership principles that no matter what you put them into,
Yep.
They work because they're people focused rather than a formula.
Yep.
Lowell has a really good point.
Yep.
He says, it seems to me that millennials are challenged to interpret and formulate text messages such that one's attitudes or intention comes through. That's 1,000,000% correct. And I often joke around about that's why emojis and GIF keyboards were invented so that we could actually understand what people are talking about. But I mean, how many times, we've all been there, right? Where you'll get a text message from someone, you'll ask them a question and they just write back, "Hey." And we all know what that means, right? And for them, they just think, oh, maybe I just was writing, okay, like, yeah, I read it. But on the other end, that's so often interpreted as, very short, abrupt, to the point, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's just a very small, funny, kind of silly example of the real challenge that we have with technology, where I may send an email to someone and it's completely misinterpreted because of how it's written, how it comes across. And that's not just a generational thing. I think that's certainly the new and emerging challenge for all of us. But Jim, what I just keep coming back to, and what I'm hearing from you, is what the marks of a highly and emotionally intelligent person really comes into self-awareness about yourself and the willingness to ask questions, to get outside perspective and what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other characteristics and qualities of someone who's highly emotional intelligent? Besides that they wear vests, because I have a feeling that Jim Rock.
Well, I'm not going to tell you what my score is. However, it is. I have highs and lows, and I know exactly what they are. You can go back to my high school yearbook and it show up today. I'm serious. What did people write about you? I dare any of you to go look to see what they wrote about you. If they still have high school yearbooks, I don't know. Anyway,
it's a chat room now.
Yeah, there you go. And it lives forever. Stress tolerance is one of those pieces. Learning to be a good decision maker, and that's taking the emotion out of the final decision. And we are human beings and emotional beings, and we live with that emotion. I'd ask you, Gabby, so when was the last time you made a big decision and emotion didn't play into it?
Yeah, I don't think ever.
Right. So if you're in business and trying to interact, on a pretty large scale, how do you take the emotion out of it? Maybe you don't. Maybe you learn to compartmentalize it and you're aware of it. You get enough information, but the leader is the one that has to make the decision at the level that they're allowed to make decisions. If you're leading others, you're teaching them to be able to compartmentalize that. Sometimes you're not going to be liked. That's the side of approval addiction that says, if everything I do has to be liked, then I'm never going to make it. Right.
So I want to jump back into stress management, because I couldn't agree more. I think stress management, as a consultant who works with companies on the stress points inside of organizations when it comes to millennials, failure and stress management and conflict resolution continuously rise to the top, because people are wanting to know how this next generation is going to handle when not when they don't get a trophy, when not everything works out how they expect. So what are some skills that people can start to grow the muscle of EQ when it comes to stress management?
You know, it sounds so millennial, but meditation. I'm serious. You know, if you aren't calm, you can't outwardly be calm. And it's not just ignoring the emotion, it is directing the emotion to a positive outcome. And as a leader, it's really directing the emotions of others. That's the key. You know, if you're good at directing emotions of others and helping them come back to a rational decision or factual information and addressing the emotion going, we understand, but if you can't get back to that from stress management, holy cow, you'll never get out of the hole.
So you're saying we shouldn't remove emotion from decision making, we should harness it?
You have to. You can't ignore it. You just have to be aware of it. So when stress comes up, what do? Your heart rate goes up. You know, some people perspire, they pace, they're afraid to make a decision because of the outcome. If you haven't practiced making a decision or having a failure or having a big win and know what it feels like, you got to be able to get there. And that's what you've got to be able to do for your people and everything else.
Yeah, I think that is a very millennial answer, but absolutely having this moment of kind of processing, clearing your mind, understanding this situation as a whole. I think one of the biggest mistakes any of us can make when we have big decisions to make or quick decisions to make is that we either don't wait for all the information or we just react in that heat of the moment based only on emotion and not perspective.
Right. And there's a fine line. In fact, somebody was saying what is empathy is one of the pieces inside of here, but you can't go from empathy to sympathy.
Yep.
You're allowed to be empathetic. In fact, that's one of for really good leaders, that's one of the pieces that has to be strong. But then they can take that empathy and direct it to get the most out of the people they've got.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. And I think a good practice is, and even a good question is to think about the last big decision that you made and what played into that decision and why you decided to go one path versus the other. And it actually quite funny. My husband and I were having this very conversation yesterday where we're just having this business discussion, and he was making a very emotional argument and I was making a very logical argument, which tends to be the case with our relationship. I'm very, very black and white, and he likes to see, I don't know, maybe some more gray in between. And I was just like, why are you making this so emotional? And we had this very fascinating conversation about how we were raised and things that happened to us as we were kind of coming of age and why we process the way that we do. And I'm sure that you can see a lot of that on the back end of the assessments that you provide is EQ something that you're born with, or is it something that happens to you as you're, maybe, anywhere from 10 to 20 years old?
They don't give this assessment to anybody under 18 just because they can't norm it and privacy and all those kind of things. But I think you can tell people that have a way of relating and reacting. You see some natural tendencies. Where does that come? Is that nature or nurture? I think there's a little bit of both. Always.
Yeah, certainly. So we have a question. This is great. If you guys have any questions, there's a question section. It says ask a question. You can also just go into the little chat bar as well, and we'd love to be able to answer your questions. We've got a few minutes left. But Edgardo said, hey, is there any particular difference in communication ways that particularly when it comes to millennials serving in the military? So I'm going to jump to you first, Jim, and see if you've seen any difference. Right. And I can share some of the data that we've collected.
Why people go into the military is one question, but they are indoctrinated, and that's the truth. There's no question about that. They learn to follow, and they want to develop leaders. What happens is that there's some friction because they don't know the why behind it. They just know the order. And that starts to boil up, and people have a hard time accepting some of the theory behind it because they don't know what that is. And and that's through discussion that I've had. That's not a scientific realization. I have talked to some wounded warriors and seen the effects on this side, and truly believe that they are as smarter than I am. Some of them have such high emotional intelligence, unbelievable, both in assessment side, and you can tell when somebody's that good. People walk around being calm. They don't have to tell people how smart they are. They just show them how good they are at communicating and everything else.
Yeah, I would say we see a really big difference when it comes to millennials coming into the military and what their expectations are, which I think certainly makes sense, because we've got a generation that's used to people explaining why, and you're walking into a very structured environment that, as you said, Jim, doesn't answer why, doesn't have time to answer why. When you're in a foxhole, it's not, how do you feel about this? It's, shoot that way. And I think that that's
Right.
a different perspective that millennials are bringing. And in the leadership perspective side of it, and what we've been able to do is work with leaders and generals to help them understand, provide the context. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to answer all the questions for them, but make it available. And I think you'll be really surprised with how many millennials will pursue that, because that's really what millennials are looking for more than anything, is context. They want clarity about what their role is. They want clarity about why decisions are being made or why things are the way that they are. And in many very legacy-driven organizations, not just the military, it's usually, well, that's just how things are done around here, which I don't think is ever an acceptable answer. I think if there's a reason behind it, we should all be questioning constantly. And certainly the military is protected from kind of the capitalism side of the argument of, in a corporation, if you're not innovating, you're going to die. But when you're working with a government
Right.
entity, they're insulated from that, for better or for worse. And so we certainly
Right.
are seeing different expectations, millennials coming in. We even see civilian millennials coming into these organizations, staying about 7 months on average and then leaving, because the kind of paramilitary organizations just aren't set up in a way that millennials are wanting to experience. So it's not that millennials can't thrive in that type of environment. You just have to set their expectations on the front end. And you can't say, oh, it's common
Right.
sense. They should know they're coming into the military and that's how it's going to be. We're going to yell at them. We're going to ask them to do these things. It's not necessarily the case. So if you just take a few extra steps on the front end, you'll see higher engagement and higher fulfillment long-term for the millennials. But too often times we just treat millennials like everybody else. And the data just shows that their expectations level, their interaction, their EQ even, as we're talking about it, is going to be very unique. And that's not a bad thing, but it takes an intelligent leader to be able to say, hey, I'm recognizing this generation is unique. Maybe we should take a different approach.
Well, and I want to go one step further, because if you're talking the millennial warfighter who leaves and then comes into a very different environment, the authoritarian environment, into a workplace that may not be emotionally intelligent, now they're really lost. So how to move them in? You got a millennial who is trying to become more emotionally intelligent, through interpersonal, but they haven't had a chance to. Now they're in a workplace. So we got a double whammy right there.
And we're seeing that, particularly as millennial vets from Afghanistan are coming back into the workforce. We've started to see different waves of what this is going to look like. And I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see, as millennials too move from industry to industry, I really see it as a cross-pollination of some of these best practices that I think millennials are going to bring with us. And this is, of course, anecdotal. I'm not the expert, you are, but But what I think we're going to start seeing with millennials is, although we may have low EQ when it comes to technology and reading actual interactions. I mean, I know we just started joking about dating. I always make references to dating, but it's true. I mean, no longer do you go to a bar and someone walks up to you and says, "Hey, can I buy you a drink?" It's, you go on an app and then you swipe one way or the other. And that's how people are meeting. They even have those types of apps for friends as well, so that you don't have to, expose yourself to any sort of rejection. So millennials, I think, are kind of creating these padded environments where you're not having conflict, where you're able to avoid it at all costs. But on the other side, I think because millennials have been raised in a very healthy environment when it comes to making sure that people are feeling supported. We've been raised to talk about bullying. I think we have a high awareness of discrimination. And so because of that, I think we may be extremely well equipped to become, very, very high in EQ over the long term of our life, but it may be very lopsided. So I think we're starting to kind of see that politically, socially, as well as in workforces as well.
That just means there's opportunity for the smart millennial to develop.
That's right. And there are smart millennials. Don't worry, everybody. I was just talking to someone yesterday about this. I said, it has never been easier to stand out as a millennial right now. I think it's a huge opportunity, and I'd encourage any millennial to take it. Keep in mind, guys, if you have any specific question you want to ask myself or Jim, to go ahead and ask. It looks like Lowell has another.
There's a great one in the chat. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Lowell wants to know, what's the approach to take when a boomer is working with a millennial who grew up receiving awards for simply being a team member, and in normal business environments, he or she does not get the recognition or acknowledgement? Sounds like that's a very specific.
I'll let you take that because I've heard your answer before.
I'm glad to see you back on the webinar, my friend. I would say helping set their expectations is going to be really key. So acknowledging, hey, I recognize how you were raised. You probably received feedback for participating, and that's great. I just want to let you know, here in this work environment, this is how we work together, where I may not come to you after every time that you send an email or do a presentation and tell you what a great job that you did. But just know that my silence does not mean that I'm not supportive of you. So helping explain your own leadership style, I think, is going to be really key, because millennials asking for feedback isn't necessarily us wanting constant recognition. It really is a search for significance in the workforce. And so helping set the expectations where, maybe it's a great learning opportunity for you to learn how to communicate in a way that's very clear to that next generation, and make sure that you're, working on your EQ and understanding how they best want to be led. But I also am very hesitant to tell leaders to always change their approach, because I don't think we're doing my generation any favors by making the decisions for them. I think giving context, clarifying, hey, this is how I lead. If you want more feedback, come to me specifically and we can talk about it. But working in this team environment, things are going to be expected of you, and we live in a very fast-paced kind of work environment, so I don't have time to go over everything. So I think giving context is the most important thing that you can do.
I think one of the big opportunities for all generations, the whole realm, is a mentorship program.
Oh yeah.
They're easy to talk about, very hard to do. And the mentorships, the people I've talked to about mentorship programs, the biggest problem is the mentee, the one that needs the mentoring, is waiting instead of proactive. And it's a two-way street, and but it's a powerful program if it's done well.
Yeah, I would say that.
And I've seen some people bloom and blossom.
Got to be the both and, for sure. So when it comes to one of the great things I think about the EQ assessment that you provide is that you actually provide it to a group You've done this quite a bit, and I think it's fantastic. And do group assessments afterwards. You also do one-on-one assessments. What does that look like? Because oftentimes we think of EQ as more of a one-on-one thing. How do you go into organizations and companies and actually provide this kind of training?
If we were doing it in a group environment, you can't get too large a group, but really what we're trying to do is you do it far enough ahead so that people can kind of absorb what's in that report. It's a little lengthy, but it's explains a lot as you move through that. Then I'll ask them to bring some examples of workplace or personal issues. And it's amazing. A lot of people will talk about interactions with their kids, when they get very emotional. And our lives are so blurred nowadays that it's not just a work environment. Probably how you act at home is how you act at work quite often. So we use a lot of examples, and I work on getting people emotional in a situation where they're uncomfortable, and getting that uncomfortableness, getting them uncomfortable. It depends on the group. I mean, you read that in when you're facilitating very carefully, but and then you start debriefing a situation, and they go, I see it. Or we pretend to run a meeting, and you have somebody in there who gets to play a role. It could be a millennial playing a role. It could be somebody else getting, not acting the right way. And you watch how people react and how they have to do that. So those kind of role plays are fun too.
Oh, I love that stuff. I love giving people different roles and saying, this is how you have to act, or act how you normally would if I wasn't in the room or I wasn't watching you. But I can only imagine how helpful that would be as a leader to know not only the emotional intelligence of those leaders and managers you have in the room, but the emotional intelligence of those that you want to become leaders and managers as well. So if anyone's interested in having you come in, and I know that you can do it virtually as well,
right,
which I think is incredible and really, really convenient. So how would they reach out to you?
Email is simple. You can actually, email. I was going to go text, but email will be easier for me. At Jim Hogan, just one word, at jimhogan.net. Right to me. And my website's jimhogan.net. You can catch me, make appointments to talk on the phone as you wish to. That's two easiest ways to find. You can find me on LinkedIn. I was an early adopter, even for a boomer, so my name is my LinkedIn profile, Jim Hogan. So it's I told you I was born in a different generation there, and would love to talk with anybody. Gabrielle and I are finding ways to interact and work together and just have an impact on the workplace and the future of work. Because if you're not having fun, is it worth it?
It's definitely not. And you know that millennials like to have fun, just like everybody else, right? Although I do too. I did have someone tell me it's called work, so it's supposed to be work. If it was supposed to be fun, it'd be called fun. So I didn't like that answer at all, but maybe that's just because I'm a millennial. All right, so we've got another quick question, then we'll jump off. It's as a follow-up. What about millennials who has a leadership position? You have a senior Gen X. Are there any suggestions of how senior leaders can work with the next generation? I don't know exactly what you mean by that. Edgardo, are you talking about how managers and leaders can help lead millennials? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. But you can go ahead and you can send us a quick email afterwards. I'd love to be able to answer that specifically in a quick follow-up. But for everyone here who joined us, you will get a replay. So if you weren't able to catch the beginning to learn more about what EQ actually means, why it's important, etc., you'll get a replay. And everybody who's watching the replay, thanks for joining us. we'll include a link to Jim's website to learn more about EQ assessments and how helpful that they can actually be regarding your team. Thanks to Jim for spending this afternoon with us. I always love to feature our trainers, people who are doing amazing things. Of course, if you're interested in joining our training team, we love developing great partnerships with experts in their field to combine the research and the work that you do with our work with millennials to do great things in the workplace. Any last thoughts, Jim?
Sorry about the early issues with the sound, but next time it'll be better, I promise. But look forward to chatting with anybody if they feel so desire. That'd be
there
great.
You go. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, guys. Have a great rest of your day.